Sound the alarm, it's a Virtual Boy game. It's Virtual Boy Works Episode 4. Red Alarm was published by Nintendo, but it's actually the first of Virtual Boy's third-party titles. It comes to us from T&E Soft, the company behind things like HYDLIDE and more golf games than you can possibly begin to conceive. According to an interview, Virtual Boy's arrival happened to coincide with T&E's decision to make the move into 3D gaming. As part of this transition, it seems T&E was bound and determined to wager on as many wrong horses as possible. Rather than leaping immediately onto PlayStation and Nintendo 64, they decided to focus heavily on 3DO, Saturn, and Virtual Boy. Be that as it may, Nintendo turned out to be so enthusiastic about T&E's first project for the platform, they decided to bring it in-house and publish it themselves. It's hard to know whether this says more about the quality of Red Alarm or the dearth of promising third-party projects for Virtual Boy. Red Alarm isn't a bad piece of tech. Certainly it fares a whole lot better than T&E's other big contemporary push into the 3D realm, Virtual HYDLIDE for Saturn. Virtual HYDLIDE was an abomination of digitized graphics that would be comical if not for the fact that it's so painful to play. Red Alarm, on the other hand, is a messy and decidedly troubled 3D shooter, but it's cool, and it really puts Virtual Boy's hardware through its paces in every respect. I can't help but wonder whether or not Nintendo's interest in Red Alarm stemmed at least in part from the fact that it feels like something approaching a proper realization of what Nintendo R&D 1 and Argonaut Software had attempted to achieve on Game Boy with quirky import classic X. Thanks to Dylan Cuthbert's programming chops, X had managed to squeeze a first-person, free-range 3D shooter out of the Game Boy's pitiful little processor. Red Alarm simply takes this concept to the next level. It's a free-roaming 3D shooter rendered in wireframes, just like X. But unlike X, it involves flying through complex structures rather than over largely featureless planes. And of course, it makes extensive use of Virtual Boy's 3D visuals. In fact, this game, perhaps more than any other on the system, practically necessitates the use of Virtual Boy's 3D graphical functions. Viewed in 2D, Red Alarm is almost visually indecipherable. You travel through three-dimensional spaces here, gunning down foes and changing your altitude and even your pitch in order to navigate corridors and caverns. Because it's drawn entirely in wireframes, you really have to rely on Virtual Boy's parallax effects to help your eyes determine relative distances and the loosely intended structures of the environments. I apologize that the game looks like such an absolute mess in this video. Red Alarm was not intended to be viewed like it's some glorified Game Boy game. When I said Red Alarm puts the Virtual Boy's hardware through its paces, that also includes the controller. It makes use of both D-pads to allow you to move through true 3D space cleanly. There are a few different control options here, but all of them involve using one pad to bank and turn, and the other to move laterally on either your vertical or horizontal axis. You can also set the lateral control to provide a quick boost movement instead of steady motion, something that comes in especially handy for dodging enemy fire. The L trigger is a rapid turn booster, and the R button is naturally your trigger. Another case of the Virtual Boy predicting modern dual analog control schemes years before such things existed. The controller's face buttons alter your speed, allowing you to move at one of three different velocities, perform a brief afterburner boost, or come to a complete stop. Navigating Red Alarm's environments is tricky, but combat itself is a fairly stripped-down affair. You fire a simple blaster if you rapidly press the attack button, and you'll lock on to fire homing attacks at foes when you refrain from shooting for a moment. The first time I played Red Alarm, back in 1995, I found it fairly confusing. Now it feels pretty rote, as countless more games have followed in its footsteps. Of course, a big part of what made Red Alarm so confusing, and makes it somewhat confusing even now, are its graphics. By 1995, I was no stranger to true 3D combat. I'd already played Interplay's Descent, which is a far more complicated and taxing take on true 3D combat than Red Alarm. It's a game that demanded so much precision I bought a flight stick to play it. Red Alarm is more of an arcade-style shooter than Descent was. But Descent was still easier to play in a lot of ways because it had fully filled and textured polygons to define its world. So even though you were banking and yawing through a 360-degree analog sphere versus Red Alarm's more rigid spaces, it was far easier to get a sense of the world around you in Descent. At any given moment, Red Alarm's world is a jumbled mess of lines. The visuals are reminiscent of early 80s vector shooters like Star Wars and Tempest. but it has a more ambitious design that just doesn't pair well with the minimalist visual style. It doesn't help that Red Alarm's abstract wireframes are paired with some of the lousiest draw distances ever seen in a 3D game. This becomes especially troubling in the second phase of each stage, where your linear progression through tunnel-like environments comes to a halt and you instead face off against a boss in a closed arena. These boss battles quickly degenerate into frustrating exercises in hide and seek. You inflict a little damage on the foe, then it scurries away to the unseen depths of the arena, well beyond the edges of the rendering engine's meager skills. Beating bosses is less about enduring their attacks than it is about finding them before your fuel runs dry, and avoiding taking too much damage from the respawning minions that appear around the end zone. I don't know that I'd call Red Alarm bad, but I'm not sure I'd call it especially fun either. It's a daring and ambitious technological exercise to be sure, but it severely overreaches what the Virtual Boy hardware was capable of handling. It's hard to come down too hard on a game that demonstrates such ambition, and in a lot of ways this genuinely feels like a game ahead of its time. It's a twin-stick, or twin D-pad anyway, 3D shooter that tries to combine linear and freeform combat, all on a portable system. Alas, the poor Virtual Boy, impressive as its sprite-pushing capabilities may have been, just wasn't quite up to the task of everything Red Alarm wanted it to do in 3D. It's a bold first Virtual Boy effort from T&E Soft, and you can certainly understand why Nintendo decided to pick it up for release. It's a pretty impressive tech demo, but as a game it doesn't stick the landing. And fighting through the 6 small stages here turns out to be a remarkably difficult feat due to the game design and tech constantly tripping over one another. Like Virtual Boy itself, Red Alarm is a neat idea that didn't quite turn out as its creators intended. Next time on Virtual Boy Works, into every life a little bass must bawl.